How do Israelis and the Jews in the diaspora collectively confront in our complex world? Welcome. My name is Tova Birnbaum. I work for the JCC in the Israeli department. It's wonderful to see you all. I will introduce our speakers this afternoon. Mr. Yossi Klein-Halevi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute and co-director of its Muslim Leadership Institute and contributing editor to the New Republic. He writes frequently on the Middle East, Israeli music, and spirituality for leading North American newspapers and magazines. He has long been active in reconciliation efforts between Muslims and Jews. Wow, we should hear about that. And serves as chair of Open House, an Arab-Jewish coexistence center. It's such an honor to have you here this afternoon, Mr. Halevi. And Mrs. Rachel Ehrman. Hi, welcome. Is APEC Pacific Northwest Synagogue Initiative Director. In that capacity, she is responsible for developing strategic partnerships with synagogues to grow their pro-Israel advocacy base and bring delegations to APEC's annual policy conference. Welcome. And with no further ado, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for being with us today. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity and also honored to have the opportunity to start off our conversation on what Israelis and Jews living in the diaspora collectively confront in our complex world. This question is especially timely because, as you've heard today, and I'm sure many of us have thought about it many, many times, we're living in an era in which many Jews in the diaspora do not feel a strong personal connection to the state of Israel and are not sure what their relationship is with those who are living there, whether you call them brothers or sisters or whether that family analogy, as we heard today, is not relevant for you. Regardless, that is a very interesting and complex challenge. Meanwhile, others, and probably everybody in this room, who feel a strong sense of connection to the state of Israel, still they see changes both in Israeli society and within our own society that cause them to question the nature of a shared experience, the notion of shared experience. Yossi, you've devoted much of your life to exploring similarities and differences between various segments within Israeli society, but also to working with North American Jews, and more recently North American non-Jews as well, to help them better understand Israel. And as a Jew born in America who has lived in Israel for the past over 30 years,
long time.
you have a unique perspective on the challenges, opportunities, and shared values, one from which we can all benefit and really can help engage us in a discussion as a group on the topic of what it is that we do collectively confront in our complex world. So I thought I'd begin with a question of what I think is one of the main issues that both Israelis and diaspora Jews really grapple with, both during times of peace and times of conflict. And that is protection of our democratic values, liberty, equality, and justice. And I'm wondering whether you can start us off by sharing your perspective on how Jews in Israel and Jews in the diaspora are confronting this challenge. It's a pretty broad question, but...
Well, first of all, hi everybody.
Hi.
Wonderful to be with you, and Rachel, thank you and APAC for bringing me here. I'm very grateful. Before I answer that question, I have something on my mind that I really would like to respond to that was said by my friend and colleague, Yehuda Kurtzer. We sit together around the same table via Skype, and at the Hartman Institute, we're part of the same seminar called I Engage. Some of you may know it's the Engaging Israel program. And one of the joys of being at the Hartman Institute is to be able to vehemently disagree with people who you respect and love, like Yehuda. So I'd like to just briefly unpack that, and maybe it will lead, Rachel, into your question. The notion of peoplehood somehow being a dysfunctional category in our relationship strikes me as short-sighted. Any of the possible replacements for shared peoplehood, I believe, will lack the vitality to really sustain the relationship. All of the many difficulties that will face these two communities over the coming years. And in terms of peoplehood, there are really two elements that have defined Jewish peoplehood. One is shared fate, and the other is shared destiny. Destiny. And Rabbi Soloveitchik speaks of the Zionism of fate and the Zionism of destiny. And he, as a Orthodox thinker, he was trying to find a justification for secular Zionism. And his justification was that especially in light of the Jewish experience in the 20th century, there is the Zionism of fate, and even if we can't all agree on what the end goal is of what is the purpose of the Jewish people, even if we're fundamentally divided on who we are and why, what it is that we carry as a people, we still share this fate. I think that in our time, we need to recognize that the Zionism of fate no longer holds our two communities together in the same compelling way, which means we are being forced to go one level deeper, and that is to the Zionism of destiny. And who are we as a people? What do we stand for? What are our values in a deeper way than just the slogans that we all know? And I think that we haven't begun to do the hard spiritual and intellectual work that will give us answers that we can then give to our kids, but first of all to ourselves. Who are we? I don't think we really quite know who we are anymore as a people. And for me, the essence of Jewishness, of the Jewish people, is the Jewish story, her story. And we need to really begin retelling our story in a more compelling way, and to try to ask ourselves the question of what does this story mean? Now, in terms of what is evolving in the two communities, I spoke the other night in a synagogue in LA, and one of the people there in the audience, some of you may know the name Michael Berenbaum. He's been involved in Holocaust education. He was one of the founders of the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And Michael posed the question, how can we continue to have a healthy relationship between these two communities when the American Jewish discourse is so heavily centered on human rights, and the Israeli discourse increasingly views the very conversation of human rights as a threat? And I think that that's part of the profound struggle, challenge that we face today. And that is that because Israel is under increasing attack by parts of the international community that speak in the name of human rights, there is a growing tendency among Israelis to regard the very conversation as a threat. And so the question really for me is, how do we begin reclaiming that conversation on our own terms, and not in a defensive way? So I don't have answers, but I think we need to really begin expressing the questions in a clear way. So question number one for me is, you have one part of the Jewish people based here that is increasingly seeing its very Jewishness as defined by the conversation over human rights, and another part of the Jewish people that sees the conversation on human rights as a threat to our Jewish well-being. That's a profound challenge that we have.
Would you say that there are those within Israeli society who are making inroads or progress in promoting an approach to human rights that is consistent with what we see in the American Jewish community? Or is that something that is harder to see at this time?
You know, in Israel, we have literally hundreds of NGOs. As many problems as we have in Israeli society, that's as many NGOs as we've generated. And I think that it's an extraordinarily rich internal effort that we have in Israel. But there is a major disconnect between large parts of the Israeli population. So, for example, we have our justice minister today, who comes from the right-wing party, Habait Yehudi, is profoundly antagonistic to this human rights conversation. And she's the justice minister. It's a problem. And so, on the one hand, you do have this richness of NGO responses, but what's coming from the government is, shall we say, not helpful. During the election campaign, Netanyahu, who is somebody who I have defended over the years, and on certain issues will continue to defend, but Netanyahu committed an offense that no prime minister of the state of Israel should ever do. That is, on the day of the elections, you'll all remember, he essentially excluded one part of the population from the legitimate process of voting. And Lucia Harish, who's here today, in fact, she's one of the parallel sessions, a well-known Arab-Israeli commentator, talk show host, was interviewed shortly afterwards, and she began on TV. And she began speaking about Netanyahu's comment, and she just burst into tears. And I found that to be a very important moment as a reminder to the Jewish majority that there are many Arab citizens who really want to be part of the Israeli mainstream. And the fact that she was so profoundly hurt by Netanyahu, the fact that she regarded Netanyahu as her prime minister, is something that I think many or even most Israeli Jews don't really understand. And so I think that there is a much richer human rights discourse happening in parts of Israeli society, but what is being conveyed from the government, and this government in particular, and again I should emphasize, I am not inherently antagonistic politically to this government. I think this government has certain advantages that the opposition would lack. And in certain ways, I feel safer as an Israeli citizen with this government than I would if frankly, if the left were backing out. But say it again.
What did Netanyahu do? I didn't catch it.
He sent out maybe it was a tweet, urging Jewish Israelis to vote because Arabs are pouring out and noharim, in droves, going out in droves to vote. And so Jews needed to counter as if Arabs voting was somehow a threat to the Israeli democratic process. Sorry for not explaining.
When you just said you feel safer, do you feel safer on a national security
Yes.
basis?
Yes.
Or safer in the democratic values of an
No.
aspiration?
Well, this is my particular problem every time I go to vote. I feel safer with the right, and I feel that if we ever do get to a situation, if we ever get to serious negotiations with the Palestinians, I would rather have a pragmatic right-wing government negotiating than a left-wing government. I would rather have a pragmatic right-wing government that tells the Palestinians that just as you believe that the entire land between the river and the sea belongs to you by right, we believe that the entire land between the river and the sea belongs to us by right. Now let's sit down and figure out what to do. Rather than have a left-wing government that comes to the table and has already emotionally or ideologically conceded half of the land before negotiations even. Is this how we should do
I
this?
think it's fine.
Yeah?
It's not exactly what I think, but I think it'll flow well this way. So as long as the questions.
So why don't you call out
Yeah,
people?
as long as the questions are on the topic that we're addressing, then I think this is perfectly appropriate.
This
So-
is on the topic, but it's not a question, it's just, I think it's useful for everybody in the room to note that we've shifted from starting off talking about the U.S. community, U.S. Jewish community, and Israel, the human rights concern on one side, to an intra-Israel, which empirically makes a lot of sense, but it's important to notice that the conversation is now about that.
So I'd be very happy to shift it back. and I mean that. Let's shift it back. I think that's real. You know, this is a perfect example of the disconnect and how easy it is for Israelis to just immediately barricade ourselves back in our own internal conversation and assume we're having an American Jewish
So
Israeli
let me
conversation.
provide a segue asking you a question about that. So given the difficulty that liberal Israeli Jews have in dealing with the government on human rights issues, what hope is there for American Jews who naturally lack the legitimacy of Israeli Jews who have served in the army and some share the same risk? What hope is there other than supporting counterparts?
I think that's a really important question because all too often what I see happening is that American Jewish critics of the Israeli of this particular government will say, well, that's the government, and therefore I can't be any part of this conversation. Well, what if a certain Republican candidate wins the presidency in November? Does that mean that I can't engage anymore with American society? We need to nurture a conversation that doesn't rely on official channels. And too much of the American Jewish-Israeli conversation has been official over the years. We don't have a rich person-to-person or community-to-community conversation. And when we do have these connections, they tend to be along the lines of LA adopting Tel Aviv, in a federation context, which I think is terrific, but that's not a substitute for LA and Tel Aviv not adopting each other, but actually having a real conversation.
Just for a moment, if I can draw us back to the original question again, and talking about perhaps similarities and differences in how American Jews or Jews elsewhere in the diaspora and Jews in Israel kind of regard human rights on this spectrum of what they need to deal with and how they need to deal with it. How, in your view, does being in the majority versus being in the minority have an impact on how each community approaches the issues?
I think in some ways that is the question, because I have a human rights problem, because I have a country, because I have power. So that's one of the main differences. American Jewry does not have a human rights problem. You have issues that you can get involved with. You are not occupying anyone. I am. And I personally am not apologetic for that. I think that Israel has tried, credibly tried, to end the occupation at several crucial junctures. I don't believe we had a partner then for ending the occupation. I don't believe we have a partner now. Because of that, at one point, I actively supported unilateral withdrawal because I was so desperate to try to extricate my society from our human rights dilemma. On the other hand, the fact that I have a human rights problem is a symptom, however ironic this sounds, it's a symptom of the great Jewish success story of the 20th century, that we went from being the world's great human rights problem to now having to deal with our own human rights dilemmas. Now, I regard that, I wish we did not have human rights these acute human rights dilemmas. Nevertheless, I think that it's a very Israeli thing to say that given the alternative, I'm glad we didn't lose the war in 1948. I don't apologize for winning the war in 1948, and I don't apologize for the fact that instead of there being the Jewish Nakba that was intended in 48, there was a Palestinian Nakba. I have to deal, and the same goes for 67. I don't apologize for the fact that I conquered them instead of being conquered, which was the plan in 67. Now I have to deal with the consequences of this. That creates a very different dynamic. So my relationship, I think when Israelis hear the American Jewish conversation on human rights, it sounds to many of us as detached from reality and more of that kind of Luftmensch. You remember the expression, Luftmensch, people of the air. Why were Jews the revolutionaries, and why were Jews the great activists? Because they weren't responsible for governing the society. So that's how it sounds to us. And I think what I'm hearing from my American Jewish friends is that what we sound to them, to you, is as hypocrites. We talk about self-determination for the Jewish people. We talk about Israel as a democracy, and then we widely go about denying these basic rights to our neighbors. So that is also part of the disconnect in our conversation in how we regard each other's human rights record, human rights commitments.
Is this something that comes up for you when you teach? For example, I know you teach rabbis every summer at the Hartman Institute, at other times during the year as well. Is this one of the topics of discussion either in your own conversations with them or in classes? And how have you come to any sort of mutual understanding?
Yeah, I mean, what I try to convey is what and I'll speak about this more in the general session in an hour. My own politics very much come from that place of the struggle of the Israeli center, which has embraced the left-wing critique that the occupation of another people is disastrous for us, and it has embraced the right-wing critique that we don't have a credible partner to end the occupation. And so I try to, when I speak to American Jews, the invitation to a conversation that I would find useful is a conversation over the complexity and really I would say the unbearable nature of Israel's dilemmas. And without the quick fixes that the left and the right, the ideological left and the ideological right, J Street on the one hand and the ZOA on the other, would offer us. So I think there are some hands. There was a question here first.
Yeah. When you speak of human rights, you sort of pre-decided a question by buying into the Arab language of occupied territories. That word is itself very controversial, but you're arguing as though that's a settled question. Secondly, how about Israeli human rights to not have 10,000 rockets shot into their country every couple of years, and not have people come through tunnels and kidnap them?
Okay, so
but the way it's punctuated by the left, it's always the Arabs responding to Israel provocation. I don't think that punctuation is so clear.
Okay, so let me explain how I personally use the word occupation. I don't believe that as a Jew, I am an occupier in any part of the land of Israel. I'm not an occupier of Hebron, but I am an occupier of another people that is in this land. And that's, for me, that is a crucial distinction. And the operative conclusion of that is that I need to see if I can reach a two-state solution. But for me, a two-state solution is a tragedy. And there's something profoundly unjust to the Jewish people in having to give up Judea and Samaria, and for me it's Judea and Samaria. It is not occupied territory, it is not the West Bank. But I believe deeply that in order to preserve what we love about Israel as a Jewish and a democratic state, I will need to make that extremely painful concession. So that for me is, I think, and I appreciate you bringing that up, because it's, for me that is the crucial distinction. And I think that when I spoke earlier about the Israeli center, I think that that really expresses the centrist sensibility, which is, it really is ours. And no country ever won territory as fairly as we did in 1967. And with the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War coming up, I think we need to remind ourselves of that. At the same time, we need to be realistic. We need to understand the nature of reality. And partition has been the option on the table from the very beginning. And I hope that we will be able to achieve that tragedy known as partition.
I think we'll take one more question on this topic, and those of you who have additional questions, I saw your hand's been up for a while.
Let's
but
try really
those-
to talk about American Jews
Yeah,
in Israel.
yeah, but for those of you who have, let's try to bring it back to the topic of the session. But for those of you who do have additional questions, there should be some time at the end for them, so just hold them in your thoughts. All right.
So I actually would like to bring it back more to this idea of the, collectively what we confront. And I know the question came out around, we've talked about how we as American Jews, what kind of right or obligation do we have to engage in this conversation in terms of Israeli policy? Do we don't have to live there, we don't have to live with the ramifications. I want to bring it back to the issue of American Jews who are living in Israel who are voting in our election, who are voting perhaps on one issue and one issue only, which is who do they think will be more favorable to kind of stay out or butting out of Israeli policy, and the impact that that has on us as we have to live with those, potentially have to live with those results.
Right, it's a really, really good question. I have, ever since moving to Israel, my wife and I have made a decision we are not voting in American elections, precisely because we would be voting as Israelis and not as American citizens. We did think about voting in this particular election. Because we actually, in this election, I would really vote as someone who loves and cares about America.
Then please vote.
I have to tell you that AIPAC brought me here, so I'm not going to tell you who I would vote for. But
Is it too late to move to Ohio?
The truth is, in the end, I don't think I will vote at all, because I still feel that I made a decision to be an expatriate, and there are certain consequences to that decision. Now, does that mean that I think that those of you who made a decision not to move to Israel should not have a right to be involved with our decision making? No, because I don't think that most Jews made a decision not to move to Israel. I think that Jews have found themselves in just the most amazing place outside of the land of Israel that Jews have ever lived in. And I was with my wife in Aspen this summer, and I said to her, maybe we won't try to convince the Jews of Aspen to move, to make Aliyah to the Middle East. Maybe that's not such a good idea. And so I think that the spirit of what we've been hearing all day here, certainly from the Americans, but also to some extent from the Israelis, is a much different conversation than we would have heard 20 or 30 years ago. And Israelis, I think by and large, have moved away certainly from the notion that the diaspora is not legitimate. I think many Israelis are relieved that not all the Jews live in Israel. And I mean that. And well, just that, and I think we also have a certain humility that previous generations of Israelis didn't. You know, we've made a few mistakes. Some of them potentially disastrous mistakes, and so we don't regard ourselves as the repository any longer of Jewish wisdom, or certainly the sole custodian of the Jewish future. The question of the borders between what is legitimate, what isn't. For me personally, I think American Jews have the right to be involved in any and every issue. The impact, the effect of American Jews will be greater in certain issues than others. You certainly have the right to critique and criticize any policy. In the end, the issues of war and peace will not be decided by the diaspora. It will be decided by Israeli citizens. But again, there should be a conversation, even a hard conversation about these issues. Where I feel a desperate need to have American Jewish input in Israeli society is on an issue that Dan Kurtzer raised, which is the tremendous expertise that you have in civil rights, in being a significant minority in this American experiment. And we need your experience, we need your wisdom, because we have overwhelming minority majority dilemmas, and we need help in trying to figure that out. So those are the issues in particular that I look to the American Jewish community for help with.
So I want to change the subject slightly to another issue with which we certainly grapple as North American Jews and elsewhere in the diaspora as well, and that's, and we know that Israelis do as well, how to strike a balance between our religious and secular lives. And we see a lot of Jewish institutions here, particularly in the Bay Area, coming up with creative approaches to this challenge, in particular coming up with alternative venues for religious, just religious experience, and also really places and ideas and things, ways in which one can experience their Judaism in an untraditional way, perhaps. I'm curious, Israelis obviously confront this challenge both on the personal level and also on the national level. And obviously there's some significant differences. And I'm curious a little bit about similarities, some similarities in the paths that we followed. We heard a tiny bit, we heard a snippet about the prayer at the docks in Tel Aviv during the first general session. But I'm interested in your perspective on how these challenges are being confronted in both communities.
I'm actually going to be speaking precisely on this issue in the next session. So I'm just sitting and thinking, well, hopefully many of you won't be there so I can say it.
I don't know, they might. Should we skip this one and move on?
Yeah.
All right,
we should.
Let's move on. All right. It'll leave us more time for questions at the end. So the other challenge that I thought would be really appropriate to address is the challenge we face within the American Jewish community around political polarization, and some of it it's been alluded to many times, even just now in this conversation. And by that, of course, I mean the tendency for an individual's stance on a particular issue, policy, or even person to be determined by their affiliation with a particular political party or a particular political ideology. And I'm wondering if you see this sort of polarization playing out in the same way or in a different way in Israel. That would be my first question.
You know, one of the conversations I've been having with Israeli friends, in particular Israeli friends who've come from America, who grew up in this country, is how worried we are about the future of this country. And I never thought that I would be more anxious about the future of American society than about the future of Israeli society. And quite honestly, I am. And I just had this conversation with Einat Wilf this morning, where she spent 5 months in Europe. She said she couldn't wait to get back on a plane to good old sane Israel. And you know, so we both had the same response. We both laughed, and yet there's some truth to it. There's some sense that we've been through so much in Israel that we know we have a certain basic wisdom to how to pull back from the very edge of the abyss. You know, the bad news about Israeli society is that we go right to the abyss, but then we pull back. In 1995, after the assassination of Rabin, I think the general sense in Israel was, we are heading toward a civil war. And the Rabin assassination turned out to be the first act, the first opening shot of the civil war, and the last opening shot. It turned out to be the end. It aborted the civil war. And there are lots of examples of that. I moved to Israel in 1982 at the beginning of the Lebanon War, and there was civil war in the air. That was the feeling, that if Israel going to war can't unite us but divides us, then what possible hope is there for this society? I remember serious talk about an ethnic civil war between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim. That's how, in the 1980s, that was the assumption. And now, you know, the only civil war there is between Ashkenazim and Mizrahim is what happens in the bedroom between couples, because that's really where this whole thing has moved to. You know, the marriage rate, I don't even know if anybody even keeps track anymore. We used to keep track. We used to know the statistics. I don't know if anyone bothers. So in Israel, and that's not to minimize the profound differences we have, but to take one example of probably our deepest divide, the religious-secular divide. I think what we have today in Israel is no longer a religious-secular divide, but an ultra-Orthodox everyone else divide. Now that's a profound shift from previous generations. In the early years of the state, and certainly in the formative years of pre-state Zionism, the culture war was between what one can ironically say the Israelis versus the Jews. The Israelis saw this new state in the making as being fundamentally distinct from Jewish history, a real break, and the Jews saw it as an organic continuity of not only going back to the Tanakh, but of 4,000 years. And the Jews won. If you look at Israeli culture today, it is from the TV programs we produce to the music, the films, Israeli culture is more and more Jewish. It's about Jewish issues. The only question in Israel today is not, will Jewishness or Judaism be an essential part of Israeli identity, but what kind of Jews are we going to create there? Now, that is, I think, a very healthy shift in defining the ultra-Orthodox as the problem rather than Judaism as the problem. And that opens the way to all kinds of issues that your previous question really alluded to. Now, what we've developed in Israel, and we're not always very conscious of this, and I think as a society we need to give ourselves sometimes a little more credit. We have developed the language and the tools to turn pathological differences and very dangerous moments in our history into moments of if not quite healing, into moments of conversation. And after the Rabin assassination, I don't know if there were people here who were in Israel at that time, what you had spontaneously emerging everywhere were conversations, organized conversations between religious and secular, or left and right. Kibbutzim inviting settlers to come spend Shabbat, and vice versa. And that is an expression of a society that intuitively understands that there are no two options here. We're either going to figure out how to navigate our differences, or we're going to self-destruct. And that is built into our DNA, in the same way that it's built into our DNA to cope with terrorism. And if you look at what's happening in the West, the panic, it strikes Israelis as pathetic, frankly, what's happening in Europe. I was in Paris recently, and if you walk around Paris, you see groups of soldiers walking around with their guns and their fingers on the trigger, walking on the streets. You won't see that in Jerusalem. You see lots of weapons, as you all know, you see lots of soldiers, but there's a certain it's a combination of a relaxed military presence. And so I think we've developed ways in Israel to deal with opposites, with paradoxes. And that's what I'm hoping American society is going to do.
I think we can.
Can I ask a question about what you just said? You gave the assassination of Rabin as an example of how a very, very loaded moment actually generated conversations. And I was wondering what you think about the fact that, yes, Israelis know how to talk to each other, but recently, I would say in the last elections for sure, you see that the politicians really are trying to sectorialize as much as possible, to turn different communities one against each other. So I wonder, first of all, if you agree with me, and if you feel that the natural willing of the people themselves to talk to each other is it actually going to be to still be the reality, or are the politicians are definitely going to succeed in destroying that?
I agree with you that there is a tendency among certain politicians to incite the tribal differences. If you look at the last election was a fascinating moment in Israeli history. It was our most domestically driven election. There was virtually no debate about the Palestinians. The Labour Party, the party of Oslo, didn't talk about the peace process. And the reason for that is not because Israelis, as John Kerry said, Israelis have it too good. There's too much prosperity in Israel, and they think they can just live with the occupation as a toll-free situation. The reason is that, first of all, we've exhausted all of our arguments for 40 years. And everybody knows what everyone else thinks by heart. We cite each other's arguments. And also because we feel we've exhausted our options. And again, I'll have more to say about that in the talk inside. But the Palestinian issue, at least for now, is no longer a defining, dividing issue, unlike your conversation here, which is part of the disconnect that I feel like it's anyway. So politicians, some politicians, who've been deprived of the animating divide, the defining issue of Israeli politics for 40 years, are looking for other defining issues. So you have Lieberman, for example, trying to turn the Arab Israelis into a loyalty issue. He's done that with varying degrees of success. Not he hasn't taken it as far as I hoped to. And then of course you've got Shas taking the Mizrahi grievance and trying to nurture it and keep that grievance alive. And the Arab Israeli politicians who come across more as nationalists and separatists than they do as civil rights and integrationists, which I think is the great failure of Arab-Israeli politics. And it doesn't reflect the majority, at least what we see in the polls. The majority of Arab Israelis are integrationists, and yet the paradox there is that they send, that's the question. Why do they send separatists and nationalists to represent them in the Knesset? So,
I have a couple of other questions that hopefully will capture some of what is in the audience's mind, and otherwise we'll hopefully get to a few more questions from the audience as well, from all of you. What do you think the impact is on Israel of the divide in American society in terms of partisan politics?
you know, there was an old joke from the 60s that an aide came in and told Levi Eshkol, you know, there's a famine, it's an emergency, and Eshkol panics, and he had assumed that the famine, that for whatever reason, the famine was in the United States, and the aide says, no, the famine is here in Israel. He says, thank God. So Israelis are acutely anxious about the mental health of this country. And we have gone through 7 years, 7 lean years from an Israeli perspective. And I certainly haven't come to the Bay Area to argue about Obama, but suffice to say that from an Israeli perspective, we've, many Israelis, I think most Israelis feel deeply anxious about the future of the relationship. And what we see happening, playing out, is the nightmare of dismantling bipartisanship over support for Israel. This is the great fear. And I think one of the reasons why Netanyahu signed this deal, which I personally I agree with the critics in Israel. I don't think this was a good deal. I think there are all kinds of problematics in it which you don't have to go into. But I think that one reason why Netanyahu didn't want this deal signed on Obama's watch was to reinforce the message of bipartisanship. That if this president, with whom we've had such a painful, I would even go so far as to say traumatic relationship, is bequeathing a 10-year grant, then the message to the American public is that the basic security of Israel is not a partisan issue. So, and it's interesting because Netanyahu has done more than most prime ministers to undermine bipartisanship. And here I think he's done a little bit of a tikkun by restoring something of bipartisanship.
And much of your work is really devoted to bringing people of different points of view together. Do you have any advice for us living here in the diaspora in terms of how we can?
Well, it's my work in the last few years has become even more extreme than that. It's trying to bring Muslims and Jews together, and to say that Muslims and Jews have different points of view is really understating the case. It's a pathological abyss, as you all know, and. The good news is that it really is possible. And the way that we do this work in the program that I'm involved with, I have a partner, Imam Abdullah Tekli, who is head of Muslim affairs at Duke University. And we run a program to teach Israel, Judaism, and Zionism to emerging young Muslim American leaders. We bring them to Israel, to Harvard Institute. And we've just graduated our 3rd cohort, and these are fantastic young leaders. They're people in their 30s and some 40s, and it's the next generation of Muslim American leadership. And what we found is that the way to get people to listen, because it's an educational program, it isn't really a dialogue. You know, they come to learn who we are. is not to be overbearing and not to try to sell them a point of view, but to speak about who you are and what Israel means to you. And that's a different educational approach. It's a different approach to conversation. I'm not trying to convince you. And my goal is not to convince our Muslim students of any Israeli policy. I don't care what they think about our policies. That's not really true, but let's say. What I really care about is are you able to understand why Israel is so important to the Jewish people? That's my only goal in this relationship. And as soon as you get them to understand that, then you have an opening for a conversation. I think that what we're losing in the Jewish world, and this is certainly true between much of American Jewry and much of Israeli Jewry, but within our communities as well, what we're losing is the ability to even recognize the Jewish legitimacy of each other's concerns. And why is the land of Israel so precious to the settlers? What are the values behind that? That is not an illegitimate position, regardless of what your politics are. Why is occupying another people so excruciating for other Jews? That's not being a defeatist. That's also an expression of deep Jewish values. And so we are losing the ability to hear each other's Jewish values. And that's really, I think, what we need is a mechanism in which we don't argue each other's politics, but we explain each other's Jewish commitments.
Right, well, I think at this point we should open the floor to additional questions. And
5
5
minutes.
minutes.
Yeah, we
More
have only-
people have it. But-
yeah. You haven't really asked a question. You made a brief comment.
No, I think you touched on it, but just what do you think, what role the both leaders made attention with the American it's very significant.
Yeah.
Because like if I compare, even during the Clinton years, what the wrong relationship between Netanyahu and Clinton, it wasn't as bad as now.
No,
it seems
for
like.
sure not, for sure not.
And it seems to me that, I don't know, that's my own opinion, that the current administration tried to influence Israel and tried to incite to a certain degree the Jewish community against, or certain segments within the Jewish community against the Israeli government.
I think that without going into the political mechanisms of this dysfunctional 8 years, looking really at the conceptual divide. And it's interesting because I think that Obama really identified with American Jewry, or that part of America, the majority of American Jewry, let's call it Tikkun Olam American Jewry. That part of American Jewry that has very strong universal values. And in some way, this was a clash between Jewish particularism and Jewish universalism. These two leaders, and Netanyahu is a Jewish particularist in his soul, deeply, and Obama. Jeffrey Goldberg said Obama was the first Jewish president. If that's the case, he was a Jewish president in a very particular way. He was a universal Jewish president. And if you look at the Seder that Obama had in the White House, that was he universalized the Seder. It was not a Jewish holiday anymore. It was the holiday of universalism. Now, okay, there's certainly, one can have universal elements in the Seder, but to totally de-Judaize the Seder is a recipe for clashing with the most particularist prime minister that we have. So I really see this as a much deeper spiritual clash.
For a while.
I'm speaking to the person who wrote articles for the New Republic. It seems to me one of the most dangerous things that's going on in this country and how it affects our relationship with Israel is how the press has let us down in the United States. I find among my friends people who are no longer subscribing to this publication, no longer subscribing to that publication, but they're doing it as a manifestation of picking a side. And they're then using the bias that comes from confirmation bias of already deciding a point of view, and then just getting more information from the media to support that bias. What do you think we can do? Because it certainly deeply affects our ability to talk amongst ourselves and caring about Israel when we disagree about particular policy.
So I want to take your question into the direction of American Jewry in Israel. Michael Oren, in his book Ally, wrote that that Israel's problem with the American media, I'm paraphrasing here, is to some extent Israel's problem with certain American Jewish journalists. And it's a very provocative statement. And I throw that out there as one more element in the increasingly complex nature of the American Jewish-Israeli conversation. And Michael Oren's argument was that certain Jewish journalists have an obsession with Israel. And he has a certain psychological reading of that. Others may reach different conclusions. And so part of this disconnect that we're experiencing is being expressed through the media, through the American media. And now in Europe, obviously, it's a different story. So I don't know how, it's interesting to really speculate about how much that critique is right. But certainly, there are Israelis who believe that, and that creates additional tension between our communities.
I think we have time for one more question. Is there anyone who hasn't asked a question? Yes.
So I'm just wondering, my biggest concern in the U.S. Jewish population, especially under 30, is really apathy towards Israel. And I'm wondering if it's time for us to start helping them and us engage in Israeli politics, to take a position, favor or against preference, to get involved. What's your thought on that? I mean, something that's been taboo today. Is it time?
A friend of mine, actually one of the Muslim participants in our program, who's an academic, wrote me that one of her Jewish students came to her very excited and said, "I'm moving to Israel to work against the occupation." And so I sat with that email for a long time. I didn't know how to respond because this friend of mine obviously thought this is a great thing. And I still don't really know how to respond. Moving to Israel, if that's the reason to get engaged with Israel, because you want to oppose Israeli policy, I think that that's a very thin basis for a relationship.
How about staying here?
Say it again, or even staying here, but if your entire relationship with Israel is going to be based on criticism, and again, going back to what you had asked, I think, about criticizing or getting involved, I think that that's a component, a necessary component of a healthy, holistic relationship with Israel. But if it's really based on my tikkun olam critique against Israeli policy, that's not a healthy relationship. A family, and I deeply uphold the family model of our relationship. A family that only criticizes each other. We all know this. If we only criticize our children, we love them so much, we want them to be better, and all we do is criticize them, it ain't gonna work. And that's true for our relationship as well.
But the question was, the problem is apathy. It's
not criticism, it's no concern because of the distance. And it's almost like the Republicans ignoring the Latino population.
Right.
It's the,
Right.
you know, the Israeli ignoring of the younger Jewish population. Who is going to be staffing AIPAC's, you know, situation 40 years, 30 years?
If the American-Jewish relationship with Israel remains exclusively focused on Israel as an issue, then it will lack the long-term context to sustain itself. I was once with my son, when he was 13 at the time. We were in an American synagogue, and the rabbi got up and spoke about Israel as a cause, and my son turns to me and he says, "We're a cause." It was his wake-up moment about the American-Jewish-Israeli relationship, and that's really haunted me ever since. And now, obviously, Israel has to be a cause. That has to be a component of the relationship because of the nature of Israel's need and because of where American Jews are living. But it can't only be a cause. And where we have failed, and this is true for Israel and for American Jewry, we have failed to tell ourselves a compelling story. We have forgotten what the story is. And that, I think, is the work for this generation. That is the intellectual and spiritual work. And there is no one answer for that. But look, I as a writer, I see that as as an Israeli writer, writing primarily for American Jews. I see that as my litmus test for will I succeed or not as a writer. Am I going to be able to tell a story about Israel that American Jews will be moved by? And that is, so that's in my particular area, that's my responsibility. But each of us has an area of responsibility. The story belongs to everyone. How do we tell this story in ways that not only reminds us of the story, but in each generation, as if you've left Egypt. There's a reason why I think that the seminal Jewish ritual, the ritual that almost every Jew goes to, one form or another, is the Seder, because that's the moment when we tell ourselves the story of who we are, who we think we are. And so we need to stop telling that story in rote form, and we're telling the Israel story in rote form, and really try to find a new language. That I think our language, I mean language both literally and also metaphorically. We need to really begin thinking in a way that none of us are absolved from